Hey everybody, welcome to our first book club on Zoom. So exciting. I'd been doing our book clubs live on Facebook before, and now we have just transitioned to do them on Zoom. So I thought that this would give people who want to be a little bit more interactive the opportunity to do that, so that while you're watching this, if you would like, everybody is on mute and the video is off. But of course, if you would like to actually contribute your thoughts and your experiences, your interpretation, ask questions, whatever it is, then you are more than welcome to do so. All you need to do that is to, at the bottom here, we've got in the, if you open up your chat window, or the participants window, something along those lines for you, there are little icons that you can use. So you can, the more button has thumbs up or thumbs down or a clap or something like that. So if you want to go ahead and use the thumbs up or the clap, use that to actually tell me that you would like to say something. Or of course, you can just go right into chat and you can just type in a message for me that will pop up and let me know that you would like to speak. And then I'll take you off mute. And of course, if you'd like to take yourself off video, or put your video on rather, then you're welcome to do that. But if you'd like to just come off of mute to ask your question or to give your input, you are welcome to do that. So this just gives us a really wonderful platform to do that. And of course, for all of you that will get this in email and you weren't able to actually turn up for our live discussion and watching this back, that's no problem. If you find that there is a question, a burning question that you'd like to ask, or maybe something that you're like, I interpreted that differently, then just go ahead and reply to the email and let me know what your question is or what you would like to contribute, your thoughts, bounce some ideas off of me, and we can have a bit of a conversation that way. So wonderful. So again, we are talking today about Michael A. Singer's book. And I'm just going to bring up my notes here for this. So this is his The Surrender Experiment, My Journey into Life's Perfection. And this is, I've just clicked on the wrong thing here, so I'm just going to close that. Okay. This is an incredible book. So I think if you've had the opportunity to read this book, then I think you'll find this little pre-story here, this precursor to us talking about it, interesting. So I started a podcast just over a year ago in September 2019. And my intention for that podcast was to allow people to have the opportunity to share their stories. So it doesn't have to be that they are survivors of abuse and trauma like myself, but because I've been able to share my story on many different platforms, it really became relevant to me and apparent to me that there might be other people that have different stories to tell that don't have a place to share them. And I would like to offer them that safe place to do so. And that at the same time, build an audience of people who would actually be able to resonate with a lot of the challenges that people go through. And more importantly, the tips that they have when they are sharing what worked for them, those tips that they are putting forward for the audience. Because of course, there's so much information online out there, you can really feel overwhelmed and lost by it all. And what I didn't think about when I was starting this podcast was how it was going to impact me. I was doing it as another way of reaching out and helping other people. But what I soon found was the incredible synchronicity of being able to meet other people that were being introduced to me because of the podcast, to not just hear their stories, but to really be able to share in their energy and learn from them. And one of those such guests was it is an amazing woman named Kelly Pietrangeli. Sorry, Kelly, if I butchered that. I had it when we did the podcast, but it's been a while now. And she runs a wonderful business called Project Me. And Kelly was on the show talking about Project Me and talking about her spiritual journey, which I have been on a spiritual journey for 20 some years now. And so I felt I really connected with her and her story that she was sharing of her spiritual journey in particular. And in there, she just happened to mention this particular book. She was mentioning a couple of books that really made an impact for her and really helped her on her path. And she thought that it was really poignant to put that forward to the audience. And so she did. And one of them was The Surrender Experiment, My Journey into Life's Perfection by Michael A. Singer, otherwise known as Mickey. And I hadn't heard of the book. I hadn't read the book. I've done a lot of self-exploration. If you know anything about me and my journey, my help that I got more than 20 years ago now, almost 30 years ago now, when I started down my healing journey was with books. And so, being able to learn from other people and being able to go on a journey of self-discovery off of the back of other people, essentially, who have written these wise words and can take you on a story, take you on a journey with their story, really impacted me, because I didn't go for books that were about recovering from abuse or trauma. I went for spirituality books, books that could answer the questions for me of why me? Why did this happen in my life? What could this be setting me up for? How can I have a wonderful and beautiful life when there has been some difficulty in that life? Because everyone's going to experience difficulty. It's all relative to the individual person. So I wasn't going after books that dealt specifically with trauma, and certainly not abuse, but all books that had a greater answer there, looking at life's purpose and meaning and the empowerment that we all have in making the choices in our lives, our life lessons, etc. And after a certain point in my life, I wasn't reading as many of these books anymore. I had had such revelations, and I had to put forth a great amount of effort to basically start to utilize these strategies that I was learning so that I could actually do the work necessary to make the big changes in my life. And that was working beautifully. But many times when things are working really well for us, we start to neglect the very things that helped us to get to this very smooth transition in our lives. And such was myself with books. I had stopped going on this adventure of reading these amazing spiritually guided books that were helping me in my growth. And that was one of the reasons why I started this book club, was to get me back into being, responsible for my own growth and holding myself accountable. And I naturally started to go back and re-look at some of the books that I could remember having a great impact on me. So when Kelly is sitting there on the podcast talking about the surrender experiment, very, very briefly, and just, passing on, brushing past it to talk about other things, I made note of it, as I have done with many of the different guests, with many different things that the guests have talked about, as I've started to realize that these people are being brought into my life at right the exact moment that I need to hear what they have to say. That this podcast is just as much about me as it is about my audience that's getting something from these guests. And so my eyes really opened to that with Kelly in particular, and with her mentioning this book. And as I looked into the book and realized that it was another spiritual journey type of book, and that I had gone so far off of my path of looking at other people's books for inspiration, that this was a real sign for me that I needed to read this book. And I didn't just need to read it, I needed to hold myself accountable to reading it by making it a book club book. And so that is obviously exactly what I've done, because here is what we are going through today. So I really resonate with this book. You might have a little bit of an idea, my journey into life's perfection. And of course, if you read the book, then you know that what the surrender experiment is really about. So it is about Michael, or Mickey. We'll call him Mickey from this point because he refers to himself throughout the book as Mickey. Mickey went on a journey in life, having a spiritual revelation of sorts, right? He was in his early 20s. He was studying economics, I think it was, very math-based and organized type brain, and sitting there with his brother-in-law at that time, and really began to notice the voice that was in his head, the voice that we all have in our heads, the ego, as I refer to it. And he, for the first time, realized that it was in existence as almost a separate entity to himself. And it was a mind-blowing experience for him. And he spent the next several years, I believe, on a mission to try to stifle that voice, to basically try to eliminate it. So, like eliminating your ego, right? He wanted to feel pure bliss and a freedom from that voice. And so he went into meditation, and he started to have a real spiritual practice of meditation and yoga, and very, very strict diet, and a very, very strict regimen of all of his practices, and started giving up everything else, and really adjusted his entire life for this, right? And slowly but surely, he started to have a few revelations that caused him to question his methods, and caused him to start wondering if maybe isolating himself from everything in life and trying to get rid of this voice was maybe not the best way to reach enlightenment, if you will. And so he started asking himself, I'll read a quote from the book. He started asking himself, am I better off making up an alternative reality in my mind and then fighting with reality to make it be my way? Or am I better off letting go of what I want and serving the same forces of reality that managed to create the entire perfection of the universe around me? Now, obviously, very, very deep and very spiritual. He's not a religious person in any way, shape, or form. It's all based on spirituality. And that's basically what he ended up deciding. I'll read you a larger quote in a moment, but that's basically what he ended up deciding. Is he started to realize that there was all these things coming at him in life that risked pulling him away from what it was that he wanted to do, which was spend the entire day doing meditation and yoga, right? Just entire day being in solitude and trying to get rid of the ego, essentially get rid of that voice, squash it. But people kept turning up. He bought property that was in the forest, and he was the only one there, and he got the help from some friends to build a small house on that property for him to live. But then people started wandering around his property. He'd bump into people walking on his land. And then one woman decided that she really liked his energy and wanted to meditate with him, so would just turn up while he was meditating on certain days. And then she started bringing friends with her who were just starting to meditate on his property without his permission, really. And, the average person, I think, would agree that we would all have that voice pop up being like, who does she think she is? What's happening? This is my land. And he experienced the same thing of that voice popping up. And that's the very voice that he was working so hard to get rid of. And so he started wondering if there was a different way to approach this. And he ended up deciding he was going to live his life doing a surrender experiment. So I'll just read you a bit of a quote here. Okay. So I now had two driving forces awaken inside regarding this newly found voice in my head. One was the desire to shut it up, and the other was the pure fascination and yearning to understand what that voice was and where it came from. Instead of trying to free myself by constantly quieting the mind, perhaps I should be asking why the mind is so active. What is the motivation behind all the mental chatter? If that motivation were to be removed, the struggle would be over. This realization opened the door for an entirely new and exciting dimension to my practices. As I explored it inwardly, the first thing I noticed was that most of the mental activity revolved around my likes and dislikes. If my mind had a preference toward or against something, it actively talked about it. I could see that it was these mental preferences that were creating much of the ongoing dialogue about how to control everything in my life. In a bold attempt to free myself from all that, I decided to just stop listening to all the chatter about my personal preferences and instead start the willful practice of accepting what the flow of life was presenting me. Perhaps this change in focus would quiet things down inside. This is the essence of his experiment, his surrender experiment. He decided that he was no longer going to make decisions based on his preferences. Now, of course, his preferences were going to pop up, right? So every time something happened, like this woman bringing a bunch of people to his land to start meditating with him in his home, where he was in the forest, specifically trying to gain solitude, that was a preference. It wasn't going to harm him. It wasn't bringing any, physical threat to him. It was simply a preference. And so thus started his experiment that when the flow of life brought him something, that he would do it. He would partake in it, regardless of whether or not he understood what it was, regardless of whether or not he liked it or wanted to do it, right? Regardless if he knew what the outcome was going to be or even wanted the outcome. And thus is the entire story of this book, is him kind of connecting the dots for us to see how this has unfolded in his entire life. And I'm assuming that he is wanting you to be able to see the same thing in your own life, even if you haven't been doing it specifically, right, as a surrender experiment, but being able to see the synchronicity in your life. And I know that I know not just by reading this book, it's one of the things that I really, really believe in is all of the things that have led me to be right here where I am today. And that I have absolutely no regrets for any twists or turns in my career, for example, loss of relationships, for example. While it may have hurt, while I may have been confused, while I may have even had dips in the money that I was earning and the quality of my life or things like that at different times in my life based on these twists and turns, that for the most part, when I look back on it, these were things that I had not decided to do. They came to me. And without me spending any amount of time trying to weigh up the pros and cons and decide if I want to do it, I just did it. It presented itself to me and I went with it. And that includes me moving all the way to England from Canada, even in my darkest hour when I was so homesick and I was distraught and depressed and really didn't like my work that I was doing here as a teacher, missed my family, was so homesick, was questioning what I was doing. I still knew it wasn't right to move back, that this is where I needed to be. I didn't regret that decision at all. It was part of the process. And his entire life story from the time of making this decision is quite profound. So he basically, he starts out with talking about some basic thing, well, not basic, but some simple things in the beginning that were tearing him away from what he wanted to do, which was meditate and do yoga, which was that his advisor at the school that he had gone to was really wanting and pushing him to go through and get his PhD, which he didn't want to do. He had no desire. He knew he wasn't going to go into economics any longer, that meditation was his life. But he respected this person so much. And so, of course, with the surrender experiment, he knew it was just personal preference to not go and take the examinations. And he ended up tutoring somebody to help them with their examinations, which happened to allow him to actually be prepared for his examinations, because he had to get right into the thick of all of the content again in order to help this other person over here. So when his advisor was really pushing for him to take his exams, he didn't actually have to expend a whole lot of effort and energy into being prepared to take those exams. In other words, not a lot of stress needed to pop up. Now, it wasn't that he went on to use those credentials for anything. It was more about the people that he met and the opportunities that presented themselves to him. His land that was in the forest attracted other people. And next thing you knew, he was interested and finding a development towards certain gurus that could be his kind of spiritual guidance counselors, if you will, as many people in the spiritual world do. And they go under the tutelage of somebody that they respect. And so for him, the person that he was really following was somebody that I believe lived in India at the time, but he had learned that he was traveling to America where Mickey was. And Mickey just thought, well, I'll see if maybe he'll come here to my little community that I have, right? There was so many people that were showing up every Sunday for meditation now. Without him putting any effort into it, thanks to this woman who happened to bump into him on his land that day, oh, so many months earlier. And it turned out that he had an amazing space for retreats. And that caused him to start building more buildings where people would be able to live on the property or visit and experience the sessions and take part in the talks that he was giving during the week, etc. And one of those people that showed up said this would be an amazing place for a temple. And again, he didn't want to build a temple, right? He didn't want anything else on his land. He really just still wanted to be in solitude and just do meditation and yoga every day. But life was presenting these other options for him. And the next thing you knew, somebody else overheard this conversation of somebody suggesting the temple, and the motions began, and money started pouring in from people donating for this temple to be built. And he built this temple. And he learned how to build by helping his friends build that small house that he had first put on his property. And then people started being attracted to the temple, of course, as you would expect. But somebody just showed up for the architecture one day, saw the temple and thought it was amazing, and asked, do you think you could do some renovations at my house? And no. Okay, well, personal preference again was, well, no, I'm not a builder. I don't know really how to do. I mean, I built this, but I don't want to go and do this and take time away. But he did, right? And he went and helped do this renovation at this house, and that led to word of mouth for somebody else and word of mouth for somebody else. And next thing you knew, he had an entire construction business building dream homes for people, where he went from making a few $1,000s a year to making $100,000 a year through a business that he had never envisioned. And just basically started through life showing up and him disregarding his personal preference because of his surrender experience and saying, yes, I'll do this. And there were several other parts of this story that turned up all throughout, like him being able to teach at a college that was in his area that allowed him to teach whatever he wanted. And he decided that he was just going to let energy flow through him, and he wouldn't plan anything, and he would just rock up and teach whatever he wanted to teach. And it was so successful that people were just pouring in who hadn't registered for the course. And it ended up being the most amazing course of perfection. And he hadn't planned a single thing, not a single lesson through the whole entirety of this program, and really allowed him a lot of spiritual growth and gaining of confidence, etc. Right? So he's gaining a lot from this as he's going. And then one day he walks into a Radio Shack for picking up something else that he needed for his Built with Love construction business that had manifested out of nowhere. And it's like 1978, and the first computer is sitting at Radio Shack. And because he's got his economics mind And he's curious. He goes over and he taps on the keyboard, and he's absolutely fascinated. It's the first time he's ever seen anything like this, where he taps on a keyboard and it comes up onto the screen. And there was no instruction manual. You had to code everything to make this computer do what it needed to do, whatever it was you were going to get it to do. And it was so new that nobody at Radio Shack knew how to make it do anything. And so we bought it. He was so fascinated with it. He was just drawn to it. And so he listened and he bought it and he brought it home and he started trying to code a program that would be an invoicing software for his Built with Love business. And he was all consumed by it. He just loved it. It was like the flow of computer coding was just coming out of his brain. Like, obviously, he'd never taken a computer coding course before, right? I'm not even sure if those existed back then, since, a home computer didn't exist yet. And yet here he was figuring out the code and building himself an invoicing software program for his own business. And because he had talked to Radio Shack about this, and they had said, we don't know how to help you with this, the next time that he happened to go in, he actually brought out printouts or whatever of what he had been doing and showed them, said, like, look what I've managed to get this thing to do. Oh my goodness. And of course, we use computers so at the ready now that, there's whole generations that don't even know what life is like without a computer. But for those of you that are my age and remember what life is like before a computer, you can just sit back and just try to remember those first experiences with a computer yourself, right? And how amazing this would have been for him. And for him to be able to figure out the code, be so excited to go into Radio Shack and show him, look what this thing can do, right? Because nobody knew what this thing could do. And Radio Shack was so, over the moon excited for what he'd be able to do that they asked, do you mind if we send some other people who are, buying the computer and don't know what to make it? Can we send them your way? And then that turned into, can we call you up to get help with things? Can we send you some of our big businesses? And next thing you know, he has a computer programming business. And he didn't know anything about computer programming before this. And next thing you know, he is being contacted by doctor's offices around the US that are looking to figure out an invoicing software system that can help them invoice all of these different insurance companies. And so he was just fascinated because he really enjoyed this, because he was still able to do his morning and evening meditation and yoga practice. He was all consumed. He didn't look at this as work. He just looked at this as something that really gave him a thrill. He really enjoyed it. And he started to see it when he started to sit down to build this software for the medical community. He started to really see it like this was a gift that he was giving out to the universe, that it was an amazing way to be able to help people, that he was in service. He didn't know what it was going to be able to do. He didn't have a grand plan for what the end result was going to be like. He certainly didn't have a grand plan for selling it. He had been contacted by 2 doctors' offices that basically wanted essentially the same thing. And he set to work creating a computer program over the course of 2 years for these 2 doctors' offices. And he wasn't thinking anything beyond that. This was just his 2-year task in here that life had presented for him. And he just simply assumed that when that was done and he was able to install that for both of them, that something else would come along, or he would be able to go back to all-day meditations and yoga. But that's not what happened, because by the time he finished these programs, he had, I think, at least 1 employee with him, somebody who happened to show up at the temple, who happened to have computer programming knowledge, who knew that he was doing computer programming and asked if she could work with him because she was so impressed by him. And it turns out that she was the key for where he had been stuck in his programming, and he needed her as much as she needed him for this experience. And hence his first employee was now joining the team. And by the time they finished this and they installed it, they basically had a major company that distributes software call him up and be like, we've heard that you have built this incredible software that is, worlds apart from anything else that's out there. We want to sell it for you. And the next thing you know, he's making millions of dollars. Right? That turns into a huge corporation, which ends up merging with several different companies. He ends up being the CEO, like all of these things. And then when the time is right and it's right for him to step down, he steps down in the biggest way possible, because the book is not just about everything being all rosy, that when you're following the flow of life and surrendering to your own preferences, that things are always going to be fabulous. Right. And so for him, the book ends, the last few chapters are all about how there was a huge raid on this corporation when he was CEO, how somebody in the business, because now they were hundreds and thousands of employees, somebody had been embezzling money, and the company had known about it and had launched an investigation. And that person was an absolute con man and had gone into the FBI realizing that the jig was up and he was going to end up going down for 15 years or whatever for everything that he had done. And so went into the FBI and actually basically, if I'm going down, I'm going to sink the ship, and just went on this whole con man kind of rampage of trying to get all of the big wigs in. So like, well, I'll give them up if you know, cut me a deal, a good deal for my charges. And basically the FBI bought it, and there was a whole investigation on. And during that investigation, the best thing for him to do was to step down as the CEO. And everything ended up being fine. He ended up being, the charges ended up being completely dropped against him and whatnot. But there was never any desire for him to make millions. There was never any desire for him to be a big CEO of a corporation. He was never his desire to have this kind of life. So with every step, he just learned and grew and really took it as an opportunity to be guided by the universe, guided by life, right? And the number of people that he met and the rich life experiences that he had. And at the time of ending this book, he literally didn't have any other plans. Obviously, millions in the bank. He's still living on that property. He's bought up all the neighboring property over the course of the years. And so he's got a huge piece of land, his temple and his home, and a bunch of other homes on the property as well. And his intention is to simply go back to his meditation and his yoga practice. And you just know, I don't know, obviously, the man personally. I don't know what his life has thrown at him at this point. That might be exactly what he's doing right now, but that has been what he has thought was going to happen all along. And every step of the way, he was wrong. Essentially, that voice, that ego, the point of all of this is that every time that voice would pop up, every time he'd start, asking questions and overthinking and whatnot, when he would just allow that voice to subside, calm himself, center himself, and allow life to present itself to him, he would find that voice was wrong every single time, right? Every single time. And I think that's a really, really beautiful lesson. So the book really highlights a lot of things for me. I know for me personally, this was a fabulous book for me to read, and a tremendous book for me to read right now, because I am a big believer of surrendering control. And if you watch any of my videos on YouTube or follow me on any social media platform or anything, then you'll know that I do quite a number of things that are about surrendering. For example, I went through 10 years of child abuse, and a couple of years ago, I finally actually filed my suit, my sexual suit against my abuser. Um, and he was investigated, and he was charged and arrested. And because of COVID, we haven't been able to go and do our pre-trial. That was supposed to start in, I think our first date was April of this year, 2020. And of course, that got postponed and keeps being postponed because of COVID. But I spent a little bit of time after, all of this kind of came out. I realized that we were going to be at least having a pre-trial, if not going to trial and whatnot. But it was a really beautiful lesson in surrender for me. In fact, as soon as I actually hit send on that sexual assault file that I was filing, because you're able to do these things online now, and I'm in the UK, and this happened in Canada, so I had to fill it out with Canada. As soon as I hit send, actually, it was a tremendous reminder for me that I now need to surrender the need to try to control this. I have zero control over absolutely anything to do with this now, right? My control came with my decision to file the suit or file the case and to actually hit send, fill out that paperwork. Then when I got contacted by the police officer doing the detective doing the investigation, I then could control whether or not I would accept that interview. I controlled the way that I behaved during that interview, answering the questions, being honest, right? Things that I didn't remember, being honest about that instead of trying to fill in the gaps with what I think happened, or, things along those lines. And then again, there's nothing else that I can control here. I can't control whether or not when he talks to my witnesses and does other investigations, if he finds that there is any evidence to corroborate what I'm saying. It's a really difficult thing to find evidence for, especially all these years later. I can't control whether or not he can put that forward and make an arrest. When the news came that that is exactly what he was doing, of course, then I felt relieved. But then again, now it's into the next stage, right? Whether the judge feels there's enough evidence to go forward, that's what a pre-trial is for, right? If the judge gets to hear the main evidence and gets to decide, is this worth taxpayers' money to be put forward to actually go to court? And so again, that's completely out of my control. I don't know what that judge is going to do. I don't know how things are going to unfold for that. And for that matter, if it does go through, I don't know what will happen then when there is a trial. I can't control that outcome either. I don't know how I'm going to respond if there's a guilty verdict versus a not guilty verdict. I don't know any of that. And so it's been a huge real life lesson for me in the art of surrender. And surrendering control of that which you cannot control is something that I have been practicing for many, many years, well before I filed this sexual assault file. Um, and so, for me to read about it in a book now, where he has taken it to a whole nother level, where I have not thought about surrendering everything. And when I sit back and look at all of the times in my life where I just felt guided to do something, didn't understand why, and allowed myself to do it anyways, it's always unfolded to the next spectacular thing in my life, right? Even just that example I was giving you earlier about moving to England and really feeling like it wasn't right for me to leave. It didn't feel right for me to go back to Canada. It didn't feel right. My original plan, that voice in my head, was to move on to Dubai. I got a job in Abu Dhabi and it didn't feel right. I went through the motions of getting the job. I got the job and it just felt wrong. It felt like it wasn't what I was supposed to do. And so I turned it down. I thought, well, but this is the plan. This is what I came to England for, was to get the experience teaching so that I could get that amazing job in the United Arab Emirates. Why was I now not feeling that it was the right move? And within 3 months of me turning down the job, I met my now husband right here in the UK. And as soon as I met him, it all clicked. I knew instantly in that heartbeat, this is why. There was something in me that knew more than my ego knew, more than my consciousness knows. And luckily, I was able to listen to it. And when I look back on lots of other things in my life, as I'm sure you are doing right now, and putting your pieces together for what's brought you to where you are now, you'll be able to realize that some of it was things that other people thought you were crazy. Some other people thought, I would never do that. Why would you go and make that decision? Or what in the world caused you to want to do that? Or something along those lines. And at that time, you just, because I know it's what I need to do, you can't really describe it. This is how I felt when I got into massage therapy back in 1997 or 96, rather. This is what I felt like when I moved my practice and opened up a huge wellness center. This is what I felt like 5 years later when I had to close that practice. I felt I had to do it. I didn't understand why. The business was a huge success. I absolutely loved it, but I knew I needed to close it. And literally within 3 weeks of me closing it and starting to work out of my home, my then husband and I separated. Didn't see that coming. I wouldn't have been able to afford to go and get a place to live and work from. I wouldn't have been able to afford a new place to live if I was still operating that business in that huge space right on the water. Right. But I didn't know that at the time I was deciding to not renew my lease. All I could say to the other practitioners that were contracted working with me was, I'm sorry, I feel drawn to close it. Right. I still feel drawn to do the work. I'm going to practice out of my home. I wish you all the best. Please don't hate me for making this decision, but I've got to make this decision. I don't understand it any more than you do. Some of those people have never spoken to me since, and some of those people just went on that journey as well and found themselves in amazing places afterwards because of that as well. And so we're still great friends, luckily. So, there's lots of different times in my life that I'm sure you're realizing in your life as well, where you have just followed a desire to do it without really understanding what it is. And he's basically doing that. Mickey is doing that, but with the added touch of, even when he doesn't desire it, when it has shown up in front of him and his preference is to not do it, he still sits and does it. He still sits and does it. And I'm sure there's loads of times where it hasn't led to anything, where he's just actually done something to help somebody and it's just not actually worked out to be anything big or major in his life. But it might have been big or major for that other person, right? So it's a really big lesson. And for me, where I'm at in my life right now, I needed to read this book for so many different reasons, for the greater picture of surrendering control, right? To surrender to the flow of life, to stop listening to my personal preferences and letting them run the show, that the voice in my head is wrong. And it's also really allowed me to um, reinforce some of the things that I already knew and practiced. But I think that's really great that you get reinforcement sometimes from talking to other people or reading books or hearing about other experiences, because sometimes you forget that it's even a thing that you're doing purposely, right? So things like when when the raid was going on at his big corporation and he got to work and all the FBI are there and he's been, put into a room, that that voice in his head wanted to pop up and ask all these kinds of questions and try to figure out what was happening, what's going on here. But then he was able to come in and say to himself, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever story we're going to spin to ourselves, whatever we're going to try to figure out is going on here, whatever we're doing to scare ourselves or calm ourselves, or whatever it is with these words, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't change whatever is happening here. All I need to know is that this is happening, and I will find out what this is all about when I'm supposed to find out what this is all about, right? And of course, it didn't take all that long for him to find out exactly what it was about, but it's a really great lesson because he sat there for the rest of that day at peace, even though everything was being removed from his huge corporation, right? All the paperwork, all the computer software programs, everything was being removed for the government to look into things. But he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't really know what this was all about. And had he had sat there and stewed in it mentally, like a lot of us would do, he would have got his stress levels up to an enormous state, right? And Lord only knows what that would have done to his own health and mental health. And instead, he recognized that that voice that's trying to pop up is just the voice that's trying to make sense of things in a nonsensical moment, and that it doesn't have to make sense right now. And that is actually mirroring exactly where I am in my life right now, because I realized in reading this book that as much as I am surrendering to something like this pre-trial that will inevitably come up at some point when COVID is settled enough for it to do so, and whatever may or may not happen after that, when something big like that happens, that I can surrender the need to control it. I do the same thing when I launch a new course or a new product. I do the same sort of thing. I put all of my heart, my blood, sweat, and tears into it, and I release it. And when it's released, I'm done. I walk away from it. It is out there. And of course, I do things to try to let other people know that it's out there, but I surrender the need to control what it's going to do, how successful it's going to be. I trust that the people who need what I've just worked really hard for will get it. But here's what I've realized by reading this book is that I am spending all of my time in my work controlling how I help other people. I have literally been making the assumption of what other people need from me and trying to offer that to them, whether it's my courses, whether it's NLP, whether it's my coaching programs, whether it's my podcast, whatever it is. These have all been my ideas that that voice in my head has thought about, and thought about, of course, in terms of wanting to help people and thinking this is something that is necessary to help people. But there have been a lot of things that have been coming my way over the last few years that I've turned down, that I've said no to, that I've not even given a glimpse at, because I thought they would interfere with the time that I want and need to put into my business to be able to offer help to people in this way that I'm looking at with those blinders on. Very similarly to how Mickey just wanted to spend his days meditating and doing yoga, and the flow of life had different plans for him, and the number of people that he's been able to help, from his temple to the buildings on his land for people to live in, to obviously the software programs for these doctors' offices that are able to modernize and help their practices to run smoother, which takes a lot of the stress off of all of the employees in those offices. There's lots of different ways to help people, right? And so I've realized that I actually need to take a step back from my business. Not that I'm not going to do my business, but that I need to spend less time trying to do what I think other people need from me and controlling the flow of my business, and rather allow the flow of life to happen and give much more credence to what the flow of life brings to me, even if it seems like it's completely out of left field and it has nothing to do with my business. Even if I feel like, wow, that will be a lot of work and there's no guarantee it'll work, right? Whatever is coming at me now, I am doing my own surrender experiment, thanks to Mickey Singer and reading this book, The Surrender Experiment. So I'm loving this so much that Mickey has another book called The Untethered Soul, and that's going to be our next book club book. So you're in the book club, you are getting these videos, you will get a new link that will give you this video, of course, but it'll give you a link to The Untethered Soul. And of course, I will see you here in six weeks time ish. I'll have a look at the calendar. I haven't checked out to see when that falls. We obviously don't want it to fall too close to Christmas because obviously people will be very busy with that. So I'm guessing it's probably going to be the new year. So it'll be longer than a 6-week term from here to our next one, but give everybody a breather for Christmas. And of course, in the UK, we're in our lockdown 2.0. And I know from speaking to some family members in Canada that it looks like there's some more measures being put into place there as well in the province of Ontario anyways. And so there's going to be lots of things for people to deal with. So we will take getting a book read in a specific amount of time off of that list and give you a little bit more time to read this. So I hope that you found this helpful. Please, please, please tell your friends about this book club because, like I said, I started it as a way to hold myself accountable, to be able to get back into reading and really, see what else is out there since I stopped reading self-help books, and always looking for not just new thoughts and ideas on things, but also just reinforcing some things. And, a book like this that I hadn't heard of before, The Surrender Experiment, somebody else bringing it to my attention, right? The flow of life, bringing it to me and it having such a profound impact on me. It is literally going to change the way that I do business and that I operate in my own life. That's incredible. And so if any of these books can do the same sort of thing for anybody else, and the only thing that they need is to first learn about them and to have something like a free book club help hold them accountable to actually getting the book, reading the book, and then showing up to talk about the book, I would love for more and more people to be able to join us. So please tell your friends about it. Send them on over to me. I believe that you can just send them over to the website. I think it's in the email that you get, to just let people know about the book club and let them decide for themselves if they would like to join and be part of this. Bless, and I'll see you for the Untethered Soul.